everyone, and welcome back to Always Watching. Today we're talking about Banshees of Inisherin, and this has to be probably one of my favorite movies, if not my favorite movie I've seen all year. I believe it's streaming on Disney Plus, but wherever it is, I strongly recommend you watch it. I've never been so pleasantly surprised by a movie in a very long time. So briefly, the Banshees of Inisherin, pardon my English, follows two lifelong friends, Padraic and Colm, who find themselves at a crossroads after one of the friends abruptly ends the relationship, which results in alarming consequences for both of them. And, in this case, our friends, this whole relationship really makes me think like our friends really could be the death of us. And it's just mind-blowing. So this film is an effortless masterpiece. It stars Colin Farrell and Gleeson. Both give a phenomenal performance, but Colin Farrell in particular, I think he's having like a renaissance at the moment. He's been typecast. I remember the days of Phone Booth. I think he was in Cleopatra. I don't even recall, but he was in some movies that I did not know he could act like this. And I think he's someone who's been working on his craft for a very long time, because the character he plays borders on caricature, but he kind of keeps it from there. Like, he humanizes someone who's otherwise pretty simple. Like, it could have turned any which way. And I think it's a testament to his acting skills and the amount of work he's been putting in these last few years. So to me, he deserves all of it for this. I think he's worked incredibly hard, and it's really an amazing performance. From the outside looking in, this place seems idyllic. But when you pull the curtains back, you realize not everything is what it seems. And there's a special kind of madness that comes with living in a small town. It's quite suffocating, seeing the same people every day, everybody knowing your business, knowing who you were, who you are, what the potential that you have. Like, your whole life story is written even before it begins. There's no individuality. It can be very, very claustrophobic. And this sense of community can be amazing, or it can be just burdensome, right? It can be a total curse depending on your perspective. And Inisherin is a very small community, but people are having vastly different experiences. And ultimately, what I think the movie beautifully articulates is that whether you're anticipating change, whether or not you can't wait for it to happen, whether or not you're counting the minutes, or whether you're dreading change, right? Like, you want things to stay the same. One person's paradise is ultimately somebody else's hell. And, there's change in terms of our outside environment. Like, yeah, the world can change and that's inevitable. But then there's also change within us, right? What's true today doesn't have to be true tomorrow, but who we are today doesn't have to be who we are tomorrow. We're all creatures of habit, whether or not we want to admit to it or not. And when these habits start to break down, we also start to break down with these habits, right? Our sense of self is so closely tied in to our routines and the people around us. And once these relationships or routines start to disintegrate, we start to break down, right? And that change can either be, a wonderful one, or it can be a totally apocalyptic, catastrophic one, depending on, which side of the fence you're on. So just to give you an overview before I discuss what I loved about the movie in detail. So the Banshees of Inisherin is set in a fictitious town on a remote island off the coast of Ireland in 1923. So I believe it's like towards the end of the Irish Civil War. We meet Padraic, who's played by Colin Farrell, and he's a milk farmer who lives with his sister, right? He's just a very simple, chill guy. And the movie starts off in this ideal setting. And the place is beautiful. Like, throughout the film, you're like, I would love to live here. Like, it's idyllic, despite this chaos in the background, you're like, this is a beautiful place. And I was reading a review, because the movie starts off with like rainbows and sunshine, and the review was saying like even the weather is fictitious, because apparently in Ireland, like, the weather would never be this good. So I don't know, this reviewer was really going in, but that comment made me laugh. So basically, Padraic, he has this routine. Every day at 2 p.m., he goes and gets his friend Colm, and they go to the pub, and they just kick it. That's their routine every day, all day. And when he gets to his friend's house, he finds him sitting there smoking, and he's knocking on his door, and he doesn't really know why his friend is ignoring him. And so he's like, okay, well, I'll see you there. And he's kind of confused and unsettled because he's like, why on earth, like, what just happened there? And he's thinking, like the whole time, like, did I say something? Were we fighting? And not only is he thinking about it, he's thinking about it out loud to like whoever will listen. So everybody in the town already knows that something's up, which is super annoying, by the way, when you live in a small place and everybody knows your business. And so his sister, in an attempt to comfort him, is like, listen, maybe he just doesn't like you anymore. Like, ha ha ha. And it turns out like that's exactly what it is. And so normally with movies, like we're used to abrupt breakups when it comes to relationships, right? Romantic relationships. Like we've kind of normalized people ghosting each other, people like leaving each other for reasons unknown. Like we've kind of gotten used to people like saying, listen, I'm leaving you to go to wherever, or like these kind of abrupt breakups. They usually happen in romantic relationships, and for some reason we think it's fine. But when it comes to friendships, it's very unusual to see this type of breakup, because with friendships, it's like a gradual deterioration, and there's a buildup in terms of tension, in terms of annoyance. Like there's usually things that build up to friends no longer being friends, but the idea that one friend would just kind of break up with another out of nowhere is very unusual. This is not something that we're used to. And so you're thinking, okay, either this person did something really bad, or this other person is super depressed. They're trying to avoid him in hopes that his friend would get the message. Colin basically finally tells Padraic, like, listen, I don't want to be your friend no more, so please stop following me around. I don't want to drink with you no more, like, we are done. And Padraic is confused, right? He's really confused. He's like, okay, well, if I said anything, if I hurt your feelings, like, just know that I'm sorry, but you got to tell me what I did, right? Like you liked me yesterday. We were kicking it yesterday. So how can you just say all of a sudden you don't like me anymore? And Colin's reason is like, listen, you didn't do anything wrong. I just don't want to be your friend anymore. And his reasons are very strange, right? He says that he's dull and he's boring and he doesn't have time to listen to Padraic anymore. And he wants to spend what little time he has left on this earth making music and not having to listen to Padraic anymore. He's like, listen, you are hindering me. You are taking up my time, which is all we have on this little island, and you gotta go. And Padraic is like, what? And so this news spreads like wildfire and sends Padraic spiraling, right? He's like, damn, like, what did I do? And he's trying his best to like accommodate, right? Like watching Padraic, like you get kind of frustrated watching him because you're like either he did something or this other guy is wrong. Right, he's trying his best. He's thinking maybe this is an April Fool's joke. Maybe something happened. Maybe he's dying, or maybe he's depressed. Right? Maybe he's depressed. Maybe he just needs some space. Right? This is not about me. So the whole time their friendship is disintegrating, Padraic is thinking like, what does this have to do with me? And what he ultimately fails to realize is like, this has nothing to do with you. It has nothing to do with you at all. And although everybody on the island sympathizes with Padraic, they all pretty much reached the conclusion, like, y'all were a weird pairing anyways, and you can't be friends anymore. Just leave the man alone. But Padraic can't do it, and I understand his logic. Like, imagine your friend breaking up with you. And I think with friendships, it's weird. Friendships are like relationships. Like, they are the same as romantic relationships. Like, it has that potential to explode. And it's how you do things, right? The level of disrespect shown to Padraic, to poor Colin Farrell, right? Like imagine your friend telling you, you're dull, you're boring, you're simple, you are everything wrong with, like you're a non-presence, like you are just so basic, your basicness insults me. And these are not good reasons. Again, when it comes to friendships, usually there's a trigger warning. Like usually somebody made someone else angry. Like when a friendship disintegrates, like the idea of seeing this person even makes you angry. But to say that I'm neutral towards you and I don't want to see you anymore, it's just really confusing. So, essentially what Colm was telling his friend Padraic was like, listen, I'm leaving you because I'm better than you. And he essentially just outsources all his problems and his failures and his frustrations out on his poor friend Padraic, right? Like, he's like, you're dull, you're boring, which means I guess I'm not dull and boring. And the whole time you're watching this movie, you're waiting for the other shoe to drop, right? You're like, okay, what did Padraic do to deserve this? Maybe his friend wants him to come to the realization. Maybe there's going to be some crazy revelation. Like, you're waiting for that moment where you're like, okay, what is this really about? And it doesn't give you that out. And that's what makes it so unsettling. And just before this movie takes a very dark turn, Padraic confronts Colm about his decision to cut him off, right? I think it's one thing to cut someone off. It's another thing to walk past them like they don't exist, right? Like, that just hits different. It's like, okay, if you don't like me, that's fine. But you're not even going to say hi to me? Excuse me? And so they have this conversation, and this conversation is the last conversation before things go left. And the whole time I'm listening to Colm, he's trying to distance himself from his friend, right? He's saying, our entire friendship has been platonic. There's no depth to you. You're nice. Your niceness just makes me angry. And, you know, how can you possibly be friends with someone who doesn't understand Mozart? Like, what a crime. And then later we discover that Colm himself doesn't really understand Mozart either, right? So there is that projection there. And Padraic, God bless his heart, like, again, the way Colin Farrell played him was very well done. Like, again, it's such a fine line, because his thing is like, I'm a nice guy. When did being a nice guy become synonymous with being dull and simple, right? He's like, nah, man, I'm just a good person who respects my family, and I thought you were a good person too. And this whole conversation about being a nice guy and, you know, legacy and what's important and things like that is really important, because, again, they're two sides of the same coin, and I'll explain this in a moment. So when all else fails, so this is the last plea before things take a crazy turn, Colm tells his friend, right? So that conversation ends, and you're thinking, okay, maybe they'll still come back, maybe they'll reconcile. But then he makes one last plea to his friend. He's like, listen, Padraic, if you don't leave me alone, I'm going to cut off my fingers. And saying that you're going to cut off your fingers, of course, confirms that he's depressed. And Padraic is undeterred. He's like, that doesn't make any sense. You need to tell me what's wrong. You are definitely not going to cut off your fingers. And Padraic just continues to bother him until his dying days. And then the movie takes a complete turn, a complete 360, when Colm does indeed cut off his finger and throws it at his doorstep. And this scene, when he cut off his finger, like when he did it, I literally shrieked. I don't know how you guys watched it, but I was like, oh my God. Like, I was not expecting that at all. And it was very unsettling, because suddenly an otherwise possibly predictable plot line just took a left. And I don't even know where this is going anymore. And you're just sitting there unsettled, right? You're unsettled because the minute he decides to do this, change is coming by force, right? Like, suddenly the rose-colored glasses are off, you know, and things just got real, right? Like, this is just no longer about, you know, small town friendships. And again, what disturbed me the most is how Padraic kept making it about himself. So now that I've given you an overview, I think what I was most impressed by with this film, and why I think it's incredibly well made, is because it's not just about friendship, right? It's about change and how we react to these changes, right? There's two camps to this. So as I said in the beginning, like, change is inevitable. And then there's always two camps. There are people who want change, and they can't wait, right? Like, especially when you're stuck in a small place, you want change to come. You want to be set free. And then there's the other camp where they don't want change, right? They like things the way they are, and the idea of change is just not something they can handle. And so in terms of dreading change, I mean, Colm and Padraic are two sides of the same coin, and I can see why they're best friends. So Colm is a thinker, you know, he kind of strikes me as an intellectual. He spends most of his time making music, and he's alone. That's the one thing that really struck me on a second watching. And when you look at his house, it's like breaking down. So he lives in this small house next to the sea. But when you go in the house, he's the biggest thing in the house. I don't know how to describe it. Like, the house, it seems like the house is closing in on him. And I don't know if this was the way they shot it, but every time Colm is with his dog, you get the sense that he's too big for this place, you know, and he's starting to realize it, and he's suffocated by this place, right? It doesn't feel homely. It doesn't feel warm, especially when you compare it to Padraic's house. He lives with his sister. you know, there's a friendliness there. With Colm, he doesn't have family. Correct me if I'm wrong, but there's no mention of his family. He's alone. So he's just existing. And more so than that, he seems very aware of what's going on in the outside world. And it seems like this outside world is starting to get to him. So the things going on like he's slowly starting to break down. And he strikes me as an idealist, right? He's someone who, you know, his whole thing is like, I'm watching time slip away. I don't have a lot of time left. Like the glass is half empty for him. And he has this dread that he hasn't done enough with his time. And he doesn't know what to do. Because on one hand, he wants to care, but he doesn't. And I think for me, the moment that kind of showed Colm's sort of mindset is when he cut off his finger, right? He described it as the most exciting thing that's happened, right? Like the adrenaline was pumping. And that's the only way he could feel again, right? By cutting off his finger. Because to inflict that level of violence on yourself, that suggests that you don't really feel anything. And maybe there's a sense of guilt with that. And this movie feels very modern, even though it feels very old, but you know, when you think about all the news that we're bombarded with day in and day out, it's very easy to let the world get to you, right? It's like, you know, all these horrible things are happening, but you still have to live your life and you still have to do what you can. And some people can't really separate the outside world from their own lives. And so they let the outside world get to them, right? They let it break it down. There's this guilt because it's like, I want to care, but I also don't know how to care. And, you know, they want to feel again, right? And I don't know if that's guilt or just overthinking, but the fact that he had to cut his finger to feel anything, you know, that tells you his state of mind. On the flip side, you have someone like Padraic, who's simple, right? Padraic is the poster child for ignorance is bliss, right? He's literally just like a nice guy who loves his family. He's happy, he's kicking it, the rainbow is shining behind him. At their home, it's very warm, it's very inviting. You get a sense, you know, they have a garden. The place does not seem dilapidated or breaking down. Like, it feels like a home. It feels like a really nice place to be. And he, you know, Padraic is the opposite of his friend. You know, he's aware of the news, but he doesn't really let it get to him. Right? At some point, he says, I hope you guys figure out whatever it is you're fighting about. Right? He doesn't let this outside world get to him. He doesn't let it affect him. He doesn't even know what's going on outside. So Padraic is a guy who, he has a routine. And he's stuck to that routine, and he's pretty content with that routine as it stands. You're like, how is it that these two are friends? But then as the film goes on, you realize they actually have more in common than, you know, poor Colin would like to believe. And I really liked how they showed the tension. So throughout the movie, as the tensions are rising, you can hear the gunshots and the bombs going off, you know, on the mainland because of the civil war. And what this suggests to me is that eventually things will change, right? So however it will affect this idyllic place, we don't know, but change is coming. And neither Padraic or Colm know how to deal with that change, right? One person sees the change and doesn't know what to do. The other person doesn't see the change coming and is just trying his best to stop it, right? Things are happening faster than he can predict. And that's on one hand. And then on the other hand, you have these characters who are waiting for change, right? Like they're waiting for this door to open. They're waiting for something to happen. And I don't know if you've ever been in that position where you're just waiting for something. You're like, okay, I'm done with this. You know, you want that opportunity and you don't even care what it is. You just want to go through it. You want to go through that door, but at the same time, there's guilt, right? I think there's one thing to be forced into change and there's another thing to actively be looking for it, because you're always going to leave someone behind. And so this is the case with Siobhan, right? So Siobhan is Padraic's sister. And I think she's very, very, like everybody in this movie is so well cast and so energetic. And nobody's overshadowed by anyone, right? And Siobhan's sister in particular was fantastic. And she's kind of between a rock and a hard place because she's fed up, right? She doesn't know what to do with herself. And she has an opportunity, right? She knows she has to leave this place, but at the same time, someone has to feed her brother, right? Like someone has to take care of him. She doesn't want to leave anybody behind. But the longer she stays, the higher the likelihood that she too will cut off her fingers. Like things are getting kind of crazy, but she doesn't know how to ignore it anymore. Like the walls are closing in on her as well. And this whole situation with Padraic and Colm just confirmed that, right? The place is becoming a nut house. And then you have Dominic. And Dominic has to be probably one of the saddest characters I've ever seen in my life. Like, he's the son of this like sadistic policeman who just abuses him day in and day out. And he's a young kid who's often left with no place to go. And he kind of seeks comfort wherever he can, right? He just kind of wanders this island looking for just any type of escapism. And he's going through these horrible things. And, when you compare him to this backdrop, this beautiful place, again, like, all these people are having vastly different experiences. Despite being a community, ultimately they're all individuals, trying to figure themselves out. And throughout this whole beef with Colm and Padraic, Dominic's situation gets worse and worse, and no one cares, right? So you're watching this kid break down. He's clearly in need of help. Everybody knows he's being abused, but there's nothing, nobody's really doing anything about it. And I think one of the saddest scenes I have ever seen is when Dominic asks out Siobhan on a date, right? He has this crush on Padraic's sister. He's kind of become Padraic's best friend. And even watching Padraic kind of talk down to Dominic, like, it's really interesting how we dismiss people when we're in pain. So Dominic is looking at Siobhan, and here you have two characters looking for an out, and they might be each other's out. And I felt really bad for Dominic because they have nothing in common. It's clear that she's going to reject him. And she's looking at him, and she lets him down gently, but you could see the hurt in his eyes because it took a lot for him to even ask her. And, he tries to awkwardly transition out of it, but I felt really bad for him because you're like, your heart kind of breaks for him. And Dominic's demise at the end of the film, it comes as a shock, but also not as a surprise, right? Because you're like, oh my God, he's dead. And then you're like, of course he's dead. Like, the kid has been dying this entire movie, as if to say, change can actually come fast enough for him, right? Like, he needed things to change faster than they were changing. And that's a whole other commentary. But so when you compare all these characters, the only thing that becomes clear is that, change for better or worse is inevitable. And out of all the characters in this movie, Colm is the only stable one, right? He's the only person that is stable. He's the only person in this whole movie that's okay with the situation as it is. And watching his world get flipped upside down is really interesting because for him it comes out of nowhere, when in fact these things were probably just brewing in the background. And what I find interesting is Padraic's reaction, right? He's genuinely shocked. He's like, what is happening here? I've entered the twilight zone. I don't know what to do. And maybe he did notice these things, right? Maybe he did notice, like, it's clear he noticed Dominic's father abusing him. Like, he notices these things, but there wasn't any sense of urgency to any of them because they didn't really affect him in any way. And again, watching his world break down one after the other, right? So his friend leaves him, then his sister, then his donkey dies, and then he almost becomes a killer, right? So his own sense of self isn't even stable, right? Like, that changed overnight. And that's a whole other commentary, right? Like, who we are today might not be who we are tomorrow. And just even how we see ourselves is subject to change, not just the world around us. And I think Colm's sort of disintegration, like who he is at the start of the film and who he becomes at the end, is fantastic, right? And it's a testament to also like Colin Farrell's acting abilities. So at the end of the movie, Colm and Padraic are together. They're standing there. They're devastated by the day's events. And this scene is really heartbreaking because where do you go from here, right? Like, they don't know what to do with each other. And there's this tension between the past and the present, right? And they're at a crossroads, but they don't really know where to go. And I think one of the most awkward moments is when, before Padraic leaves, Colm says, "Listen, thanks for watching my dog." And Padraic says, "Anytime." As if to say, like, I don't know what else to do. I can't close this door, even though I know I have to. And they're paralyzed, right? Like, they're paralyzed and they don't know where to go from here. And I don't know how Colin is still alive with his lack of fingers by the end of the movie, but that's a whole other conversation. So ultimately, I think this is a beautiful movie about not just human relationships, but our relationship with ourselves and how we build our relationships. Like, how we see ourselves is largely determined by whether or not we like it, our relationships with other people. And the minute that changes, we change, you know. And again, just this idea of change, not just in the outside world, but just us as human beings, right? Like who we are today doesn't have to be who we are tomorrow. And they're just paralyzed at the end, right? Like they know they have to move forward, but they don't want to. And it was beautifully well done. And I don't have enough to say about it. And so you guys let me know what you think, and until next time.